Hello, we're back again, and man, excited to be here with you guys. It is a great day. It's a great day because God ultimately is doing some work inside of us. And every time that work happens inside of us, that means that we're changing and being affected. And as we're being affected, God's doing something great. And so that's something that I want to talk about today, is that how we learn to roll with the punches that come in life. As I was thinking about this, I thought about how a boxer prepares for a big match, a big fight. The boxer will always get in the ring and he'll box other boxers. And while they're doing that, a lot of times during training, they're getting hit a lot. They'll face one boxer for one round, then another boxer for the next round, another boxer for the next round. And what that's doing is that's preparing them for the fight that is coming up ahead of them. It just doesn't take place because they want to have a fight, but ultimately it takes place because they're looking to God. They're looking to that opportunity and saying, this is what we're going to do. This is what it takes for me to prepare and do these things. Now, if a boxer said, well, I'll do everything else that it takes in training except I don't want to get hit, ultimately they're not going to be a very good boxer because they're not preparing their body to receive a hit that comes in this life. And it's the same thing with what we deal with. Sometimes we have this idea that when we become Christians or we serve God, that everything's just going to be like a peaceful stroll down the street. One of those Disney movies where you're watching and this is what's going on, and it's like it just isn't reality. And ultimately, that's what it comes back down to, is realizing that idea that it isn't reality. We have to trust God and live for God. And ultimately, things are going to come up. And so, as we continue this series about the roaring 20s, we can't get caught staying still. The stagnant life, man, that's a wrong life to live. That's a nasty life to live, because ultimately, when you think of stagnant water, and I've shared this, but stagnant water, that is one of the most foul-smelling things. And it's the same way in our life. If we don't continue to move, we become stagnant, and ultimately we become just foul-smelling people. And so this is what God has called us to do, is learn to roll with the punches. And so if you have your Bibles, James 1 is what we're going to talk about. James 1 chapter 2 says this. It says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kind." I read this and I'm like, really? I'm supposed to be excited about these things? But ultimately, what God is looking at is, yes, be excited, because it's not what is happening now that we're excited about, but it's about who we're becoming in the future. It's time to face these today. "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Verse 3, "Because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything." I think when you finish something, you should always have that heart that at the end of it, you want it to be complete. I think, if you went and bought a model car, or you went to build a house, you don't want to go and sign the papers at the end of it and say, oh good, the house is almost complete. No, you want to buy a completed house. Yeah, we finished it, except we just didn't build this last wall. And that whole idea, that doesn't make sense. But God is telling us that your life will become complete, which means that we're missing some things today. That through trial and perseverance, that we're going to find these things. And so ultimately, that's the whole idea here, is that we are learning what perseverance will bring us through trials. Consider it pure joy that you'll be complete. That's the idea that it comes down to. Trials are going to come and go, but how we go through those trials develops something within us. And so last week we talked about that whole idea of the mistakes and the learning to forget the reset button. This week we're going to learn to roll with the punches that God's not put in our life, but that life brings in our life. But we have God in our corner telling us, you can do it. You can do it. You can do it. You can do it. You can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. Come with a boldness, like a roaring lion, This is what God has called us to do, that you're the head and not the tail. That today is the day that God is in. Live life to the fullest. That's what it comes back down to. Simply, if we will trust God and move forward with Him, good things are going to come. Because God works from the present to the future. That's what today is about. Living for today. Living for the fullness of today. And so that whole idea comes back down to that there's a reason that you may be going through these things. Because ultimately you can't see the future. You've just got to live by faith. Because today you may be walking through something that you don't know how you're going to handle it, but it's preparing you for something even greater in the future. You know, as I was thinking about this and just the times that we're going through, there's a lot of opportunity to just get caught up in all the negative things, the things we don't have, the lack of, instead of the fullness of a complete God. We have an incomplete enemy trying to battle a complete God. And so this idea we need to come back to and understand that you're called for a time as such as this. I think about the story of Esther. And in the story of Esther, there was a king that wanted a new wife. And he sent his people out to go all over the world to find the most beautiful of women. And they would bring them forward, and they would all come forward. And he was going to pick just one. And I remember as you read throughout the word, it talks about how they went through this ritual and this process and everything. Well, it finally came down to the moment where Esther was picked. Esther was the hand-picked one, and then she spent a year getting prepared to be his wife. And I think about that, and I think sometimes we don't even want to spend 10 minutes preparing for what God has for us in the future. We have a lot of distractions in this world. A lot of things that take our focus off of what is in the future. I listened to one of the pastors, one of the most famous pastors in the world right now. Joel Osteen was talking about how we need to have a life plan, a purpose, a driven goal that is out in front of us. And when we have that, we live today to move towards that tomorrow. And ultimately, God is the one that is in with us today that sets the plans for tomorrow. That's where we have to start living, is full of today, so that we can be ready for tomorrow, because today is preparing us for what's coming. And that's where Esther comes in, is she was spent 12 months preparing for a moment for her to become the king's wife. And so this year finishes, this process is done, and she becomes the king's wife, and she's married, everything's good. And a few years later, they come across her uncle, whose name is Mordecai, is just continually looking out for his niece and always has the right heart. This is what you need to do. Here's how you need to do it. It's those mentors in life that we need. And so he was one of hers. And there was a guy that was also there that was one of the king's assistants that didn't like Mordecai, because one time Mordecai didn't bow down and worship this guy like everybody else did. Mordecai looked and said, "I only bow down to the Lord and the Lord of God, the Lord of Lords." And that time and that moment infuriated this guy. And so he put a plan together to destroy all the Jewish people. Well, Esther was a Jewish woman. And as Esther was going through this process, Mordecai came to her at one point and he said, "You have to do this." Well, you have to understand the customs back then. Nobody walked in to just meet with the king. The king would call you in. If you walked in to meet with the king, you would die. You would be killed at that moment. And so for her to go to the king and just say, "You can't do this," would be the end of her. And so she was very fearful of what may happen. But Mordecai comes to her and he says this thing in Esther chapter 4, verse 4. It says, "When Esther's maids had come and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of the sackcloth that he would not accept. Then Esther summoned one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend to her and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. And we go down through here and we get to the point where Esther's talking to Mordecai. And it says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do you not think, and what she said is that I may die. If I go to the king, I may die. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are the king's house, you are alone of all the Jews will escape. You alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this. That you were handpicked by God for such a time as this, to be ready and be prepared. Esther met with the king and basically changed everything around once the king, who loved her very much, everything changed because she stood up and said, I'm going to do this. And that's ultimately what God has for us today. Learning to roll with the punches, because good things are going to come and bad things are going to come. Trials and tribulations only bring in perseverance. And that perseverance delivers something inside of us. It creates this thing inside of us. And so we need to understand what God is doing today. That we're being prepared, because ultimately there may be a moment that you were in this for such a time as this. So don't get focused on the future too much. Don't get focused on the past, because the past doesn't define the future. God defines the future. If you're not living for today, then ultimately you're getting passed by those who choose, who have made a choice to say, I'm going to live today and I'm going to grow. That's what God has for us, living to the fullness of life through God. I just challenge you and I encourage you, listen, get back up. Enjoy what God has for you, because great things are coming if we'll stay focused on the one who creates the future, not the one who defines the past. Trust God and watch what He can do. It's time to get back up. I encourage you, be open again. Just be honest with people and watch what He can do tonight. I pray that God opens your heart, that you may receive what we taught today, and that it will change and affect your world in a greater way. Let's learn to roll with the punches. We'll see you next week.